The signal came at dusk. That was the thing nobody had figured out until it was too late. Not the xenobiologists, not the Joint Defense Analysis teams, not the 3-star generals who had eaten their pistols in the second week when the casualty projections came in and wouldn't stop climbing. The Varric didn't use weapons the way humans used weapons. They didn't drop ordnance or send kinetic impactors or blanket a hemisphere with radiation designed to cook tissue from the inside. They were too old for that, too patient. What the Varric did was considerably worse and considerably more elegant, if you had the stomach to call it that. They broadcast twice a planetary rotation, once at the local equivalent of dusk, once at the local equivalent of pre-dawn. The Varric emitters networks that ringed every occupied world in their sphere sent out a tight band, resonance pulse. You couldn't hear it. You couldn't feel it with your skin. The pulse was designed to interact with a specific protein complex in deceased neural tissue, a complex that exists in every known carbon-based species across 11 star systems, and it triggered reactivation, not resurrection, not anything so clean or romantic as that. The pulse told dead cells to fire. It told dead muscle to contract. It told dead things to walk and to hunger and to move toward warmth and sound and the electrical static of a living nervous system. The Varric called this their quiet reclamation. Humanity called it something that cannot be repeated in polite company. Sergeant First Class Mara Voss had been on Karev Station for 11 months before the occupation began. She'd come as part of the Colonial Defense Augmentation Force, a grandiose name for what was essentially of 200 soldiers and a handful of embedded civilian advisors sent to protect the mining infrastructure on the second moon of a gas giant. The colonists had started calling Gregor because the gas giant's atmospheric bands were the particular bruised purple of a man Mara had never met, but apparently a lot of the original settlers had known. She hadn't asked. The colonial types had their traditions, same as soldiers had theirs. The Varric arrived in the 83rd day of her deployment. There was no declaration of war. There was no communication at all. Not then, not ever, really. The Varric simply appeared above the horizon in ships that were more like architecture than vehicles. Vast tessellated structures that absorbed light in ways that made the eye skid off them. And the shooting started 40 minutes later, when a colonial security patrol came around the corner of the processing plant on the north edge of settlement and found 3 Varric standing over the bodies of 2 maintenance workers. The security patrol opened fire. The Varric opened fire back. Inside 6 hours, 2/3 of the station's surface structures were burning. Mara had been in the middle of a maintenance cycle on her rifle when the first shots came. She dropped the cleaning kit and started running, and hadn't really stopped since. That had been 19 days ago. She was in the lower cargo hub of the station's transit terminal now, with 14 other people, 11 survivors of her original SADAF unit, 2 colonial settlers named Pavel and Dara Oren, who'd been separated from the main evacuation and found their way into the same crawl space as Mara's squad 3 days back, and a man from the Colonial Resource Administration named Harwick, who wore clean clothes in ways that made everyone else's filth seem more pronounced, and who had opinions about everything and authority over nothing. The cargo hub was good shelter, or had been. 3 solid walls, thick, insulated panels that broke thermal signatures at least partially, access to a secondary power conduit that still pulled intermittent charge from the station's buried reactor. The main cargo doors had been welded shut from the inside on day 2. The service tunnels were blocked with everything they could stack. The only way in or out was a narrow access corridor on the east wall that required a person to turn sideways, and had a triple-locked pressure door at each end. It would have been excellent. It would have lasted, except for the dusk signal. Mara heard it described later by people who had survived long enough to compare notes in the refugee corridors of the evacuation ships as feeling like teeth in your spine. That wasn't right, or at least that wasn't how it was for her. For Mara, it was silence. A sudden absolute silence in the ambient noise of the world. as if every background vibration had been cut with a knife. And then, in the silence, something that might have been a low harmonic tone, or might have been the sensation of a very cold hand closing around the base of her skull. And then the silence ending, and the dead beginning to move. 19 days in. She'd lost 8 of her soldiers and hadn't counted the colonials because she'd made herself stop counting. The bodies of the dead were a problem in a way she'd never had to account for in her previous deployments, because the dead did not stay dead once the dusk signal came. Any body on the surface, or in any structure that wasn't adequately shielded, would reanimate at the pulse and stay mobile until the pre-dawn signal, a 6-hour window, every single rotation, that you spent either hiding very quietly or fighting your way through what used to be people you knew. Corporal Delia Chen had been the first one lost to it. Not to the Varric themselves, to a reanimated maintenance worker in the crawl space between the 2nd and 3rd hub levels. On day 4, before Mars' squad had fully understood the mechanism, Chen had gone forward to check a noise. And the thing that had been Arpad Ferris, from the Western drill team, had been crouching in the dark with its head tilted at the precise angle of a question it would never ask, and it had taken 3 of Chen's fingers before Reyes pulled it off her and stamped, its skull flat against the conduit housing. Chen had made it 6 more days. Mara didn't think about Chen. She had gotten very good at not thinking about specific people. "Signal's coming," said Reyes, from his position at the single reinforced viewport that gave a partial view of the transit plaza outside. He said it the same way he said everything. Flat even, the vocal equivalent of a man who had made peace with the things that were true and wasn't going to waste energy being upset about them. She'd served with Reyes for 7 years, and she'd never once seen him rattled. She suspected he would be the exact same way about his own death when it came. Mara checked her watch. 1847 local. Dusk in 9 minutes. "Seals tight?" she said. "Check twice," said Private Aneka OC from the East Corridor. OC was 22, the youngest in the unit, and had the particular competence of people who had grown up in circumstances where competence was not optional. She'd grown up on a mining station not entirely unlike this one. She moved in tight spaces like water. "Fuel cells? Enough for the night. Maybe 2 nights if we stretch it," said Reyes, without turning from the viewport. "Then we're not stretching it," said Harwick, from his customary position near the back of the space, on a crate that was marginally higher than the surrounding crates, a vantage point he had chosen with the instincts of a man accustomed to being the highest person in any room. "We're using what we need to move tonight." Silence. The particular silence of a room full of tired people who have learned to wait before they respond to provocations. "Harwick," said Mara, "we've been over this, Sergeant. The CRA emergency protocol is clear. All civilian administrative personnel are evacuation priority 2, which means you get on the first ship same as everyone else. Same as I've told you. Same as nothing has changed," said Mara. She kept her voice level, the way Reyes kept his, with the same practiced, nowhere particular tone of a person depositing a fact and moving on. "What has changed is that we have one confirmed route to the secondary landing pad, and we're using it at first light. Same plan, same timeline. The timeline was based on a 23-hour window. We've now been here 29 hours past the original." Harwick. She said his name the second time differently than the first. The first was a comma. The second was a period. Harwick subsided. Pavel Oren, sitting cross-legged on the deck with his back against a coolant pipe, his wife Dara's head on his thigh, watched this exchange with the careful attention of a man filing information for later use. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, in the way of people who had done physical labor most of their lives, with a beard that had grown from neat to architectural. In the 19 days since personal grooming had become an abstraction, he hadn't said much in the 3 days since they'd found Mara's group. He watched. He listened. In Mara's experience, those were the 2 most undervalued skills a person could have. 8 minutes to dusk. "Tell me again about the route," said Dara Oren, who was not asleep. She opened her eyes without lifting her head. Her voice was the steady voice of a woman who asked questions because she wanted information, not because she needed comfort. Mara traced it in her mind the way she had traced it 100 times. East corridor, through the pressure door and out onto the service platform. Then north, along the maintenance track, to the junction where it met the main transit artery, then west for approximately 400 meters. Open transit plaza, minimal cover, the part that made her jaw tight when she thought about it in the daylight. Then, into the secondary terminal building, and down 2 levels to the emergency landing pad where a colonial transport, if the pre-positioned evac plan had held, was waiting with a launch window every 48 hours at 0300. The transport would be there. She had to operate on the assumption that it would be there, because the alternative was a line of thinking that ended badly. Same as before, she said. We move at first light. Pre-dawn signal drops the reanimates. We have a 90-minute window. Before sunrise brings the Varric patrols back to full strength. We move through the window. What if the reanimates are clustered on the plaza? Dara said. We go through them with what? With what we have. Dara considered this. She reached up and took Pavel's hand without looking at it. Found his fingers without searching for them, the way you find things you have touched 1,000 times. All right, she said. 5 minutes to dusk. The sound, when it came, was not a sound. That was the only way to describe it to someone who hadn't experienced it. It was the space where a sound would be, if sound could be made of absence. Mara felt it in the back of her sinuses, in the cartilage of her ears, in the specific vulnerable place between her shoulder blades, where the spinal cord runs close to the surface. Everyone in the room felt it. She could see it in the slight forward tilt of Reyes's shoulders, the way Osi's chin dropped a degree, the way Pavel Oren's grip on Dara's hand went from relaxed to white-knuckled, without any intervening gradations. Then the quiet ended. Outside the sealed cargo doors, through 3 layers of composite panel and insulating foam and welded steel, they heard the dead begin to move. It was a particular sound. Mara had catalogued it with the unpleasant precision of someone who needed to identify it in darkness from 100 meters away. There was the shuffle drag of feet that moved without the neurological precision required for a proper stride. There was the low vocalization, not language, not quite animal either, more like the sound a radio made when it was searching frequencies and had not found one yet. And there was a third component, the one she had never been able to describe adequately to anyone who hadn't heard it, which she privately thought of as the breathing that wasn't breathing, a rhythmic wet expansion and contraction of chest cavities that had no use for oxygen, but were contracting anyway because the signal said contract. It was the most frightening sound she had ever heard in her life, and she had heard some significant competition. 6 hours, said Reyes, still at the viewport. 6 hours, Mara confirmed. Harwick made a noise. Not words, just a noise, small and involuntary, that he immediately clamped down on. Mara watched him do it and did not say anything about it. She'd watched Harwick in the 19 days. She'd watched him very carefully, the way she watched everything she couldn't afford to be surprised by. He was frightened, which was rational. He was entitled to his allocation of a functioning survival instinct. What concerned her was the particular quality of his fear, the directionality of it, the way it seemed to point not outward at the things that would kill them all impartially, but inward, at calculations she wasn't privy to, at contingencies he hadn't shared. He'd had 2 conversations on the emergency band in the last 4 days. When he'd thought she wasn't close enough to hear, she'd been close enough to hear. She hadn't made enough of it yet to act on, but she was cataloging. Private First Class Torres was looking at her from across the hub. The look a good soldier gives a commanding officer when they are asking with their eyes what their mouth isn't saying. Torres had heard the same conversations. Mara gave her the smallest possible nod. Yes, I know, I'm watching it. Torres relaxed infinitesimally. The 6 hours passed the way all long watches in terrible circumstances pass. Not slowly, exactly. but with a particular density, each minute seeming to contain more material than a normal minute. More texture, more weight. Mara ran through the route again, with Reyes and Torres and Ose. She checked every weapon in the group, even the crude tools. Pavel had repurposed into impact weapons with the methodical ingenuity of a man who had spent decades solving problems with whatever materials the mining operation happened to have on hand. She ate a ration bar she didn't taste. She watched Dara Oren sleep for real this time, and Pavel watched the cargo door and Osi do the 100 small maintenance tasks that kept the pressure seals sound. And Harwick, in his corner, running his thumb over the screen of a device that Mara had noted but not confiscated. At 0047, she went to Reyes and said quietly, "Harwick's signaling someone." Reyes' expression did not change. "Varick Interface Network? I don't know. The device is CRA standard issue. Those things can bounce off anything that'll carry a signal." "You want me to take it?" She thought about it. "Not yet. I want to know what he's saying first." "How are you going to find that out without confronting him?" "Same way I always find things out," she said. "I watch and I wait, and I let people show me what they are." Reyes looked at her for a moment. "You're very patient for someone who is clearly furious." "I've had practice." At 0214, the pre-dawn signal came. It was the inverse of the dusk signal. Not absence, but a brief filling in. A sense of something completing itself. And then it was gone, and the sounds outside changed. The shuffling slowed. The vocalizers taped. Through the viewport, Reyes watched 3 reanimates in the transit plaza simply stop mid-stride and fold. Not falling dramatically, just releasing, the way a person releases when they finally let themselves sleep. "Pre-dawn," said Reyes. Mara was already up. Everyone on their feet. Full kit. 90 seconds. The discipline was good. That was the thing about soldiers. Even spent soldiers. Even soldiers who'd been eating bad rations and sleeping in shifts in a cargo hub for 19 days. Was that the muscle memory was still there. Torres had her kit sorted in 40 seconds, flat. Osi was at the corridor door, with her hand on the first lock, before Mara had finished her own check. Even Pavel and Dara, civilians, moved with a focused efficiency that spoke to a lifetime in environments where slowness was its own kind of danger. Harwick was last. He fumbled with his carry kit. He wasn't looking at Mara. He was looking at the device in his hand, and his thumb was moving. She crossed the space in 4 steps. She put her hand on his wrist, not grabbing, not violent, just placing her hand over the device with the calm of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do. "Give me the device," she said. He looked up at her. His face had several things happening in it at once. Calculation. Guilt. Something harder underneath both. "This is CRA property. And you are CRA, and you are in my unit. And right now we are moving," said Mara. "The device stays here. Or the device comes with us and I carry it. Those are the options. You can't." "I can. I just told you I was going to," which is me being more courteous than the situation requires. She kept her voice quiet. Not gentle. There was no gentleness available for this moment. But quiet, level, measured. The voice of a person who is not confused about what they're saying or why. A long beat. Harwick put the device on the crate beside him, not giving it to her. Setting it down. The specific passive resistance of a man who had decided to comply, while preserving the ability to claim he hadn't surrendered. "We'll discuss this when we're clear," said Mara. She picked up the device and put it in her own kit. The east corridor was 3 meters long, the width of a turned sideways body, and smelled of hydraulic fluid and old metal, and the particular staleness of recycled air that hadn't been refreshed in 19 days. Mara went first, then Torres, then Osi, then Pavel and Dara together, then the rest of the unit in pairs, and Harwick in the middle of the column, where he would be surrounded by people who would notice. If he did something she hadn't authorized. Reyes came last. The first pressure door opened on the 3rd attempt. The lock mechanism had been cycling oddly for 2 days, and Osi had rigged a workaround that required precise timing and a specific sequence that Osi had written in permanent marker on the back of her left hand. The service platform was cold and dark, and smelled of open air for the first time in what felt like a geological epoch. Mara stood on the platform for 3 seconds and just breathed. Then she pointed north, and they moved. The maintenance track ran between 2 rows of equipment housings that provided cover on both flanks, which was why she'd mapped the route through it, rather than taking the more direct surface path. The reanimates were down. She could see 2 of them in the gap between housings, crumpled in the way of the pre-dawn release, arms still extended in the reaching posture they'd held. At the moment, the signal cut. She stepped over one and didn't look at its face. Torres was 2 steps behind her, and to the right, rifle up, scanning the far end of the track, where it opened onto the transit junction. Osi had pulled ahead to the left. She had better eyes than anyone in the unit, some genetic gift she'd mentioned once without making a thing of it, and she moved through dark spaces with the particular ease of someone who had never entirely trusted light sources. Pavel Oren was keeping pace in the middle of the group, with Dara matching his stride exactly, and Mara found herself thinking that those 2 had been doing this, had been moving together through difficult terrain for so long that it had become a single organism, a shared locomotion that didn't require communication. She thought about what it would be like to have that, and set the thought aside. The transit junction was clear. They turned west. 400 meters. The transit plaza opened up ahead of them like a held breath, wide and flat and exposed. The overhead canopy structure that had once sheltered it from Karev's harsh ultraviolet now buckled in 3 places and letting in columns of the pre-dawn dark. She could see reanimates in the plaza, but they were down, 6 or 7 of them distributed across the open ground, folded in the postures of the signal's mercy. The Varric emitter tower on the eastern edge of the plaza was dark. They ran the towers dark during the reanimate window, presumably to avoid confusing their own forces, which told her something about the Varric's relationship with their own weapon that she found grimly useful. "Clear for now," said Reyes behind her. "How long to cross?" 4 minutes at pace. "And sunrise?" She checked her watch. 41 minutes. "That's comfortable. I know. I don't trust comfortable." She went. They were 2/3 across the plaza when the Varric Hay Patrol came around the south side of the canopy structure. There were 4 of them. Varric were not large. That had surprised most people who hadn't seen them in person. The news imagery tended to emphasize their architecture and their weapons, and not the beings themselves, who were roughly human-sized, bilaterally symmetrical, with a front-to-back elongation of the head that gave them a profile like a blade. Their sensory apparatus was concentrated in a band across the upper half of the face. No discrete eyes, just a band of receptor cells that could resolve detail across a 360-degree arc, which meant there was no sneaking up on a Varric, and there was no hiding from one if it was pointed in your general direction. All 4 of them were pointed in Mara's general direction. "Down," she said, at the exact pitch and volume that carries us 2 meters, and no further. The group went flat. Soldiers instantly. Pavel and Dara a half-second behind. Harwick a half-second after that, which was fine. They were all on the deck before the patrol finished its turn, and the leading Varric's sensory band swept across the plaza. She counted. The patrol was not in standard sweep pattern. It was moving with a directional purposefulness that suggested it was going somewhere rather than looking for anything. If they maintained their heading, they'd pass 30 meters south of Mara's position without a direct line of sight. She was about to exhale when she heard, from 2 meters to her left, the sound of Harwick's device. Not a signal tone. A tactile pulse, a vibration, the device acknowledging an incoming transmission, the subtle buzz of it against the cargo panel she'd stuffed it into. The leading Varric stopped. Its sensory band swiveled. Mara had exactly one option, and she took it without deliberating. She pulled the device from her kit, confirmed the transmission was still active. It was. Harwick had apparently staged it to auto-activate on a timer, not on his command, which meant he'd set this up before she took the device, and she hurled the device in a low flat arc to the east, 40 meters. where it clattered against the base of the emitter tower and bounced and went still. The Varric patrol turned east and moved toward the sound. She gave them 8 seconds. Up, she said. Pace, not run. They crossed the remaining 130 meters of plaza at a fast walk. Controlled. The specific discipline of people who know that running triggers pursuit instincts in predators, and that every meter of distance between them and the patrol was a margin they needed to preserve. Mara counted steps. Torres counted something under her breath that Mara didn't ask about. They reached the secondary terminal door. Osei had it open in 11 seconds. Inside, down 2 levels, and Mara allowed herself, for the first time in 11 months on this moon, for the first time in 19 days in this particular hell, to lean her back against the wall at the top of the stairwell and close her eyes for 3 seconds while she waited for the sound of pursuit. No pursuit. 3 seconds. She opened her eyes. Move, she said. They moved. The landing pad was there. The transport was there. A colonial medium hauler, scarred along one flank, with the distinctive burn pattern of a Varric-directed energy weapon, patched over with what appeared to be scrap hull, plating from a different vehicle entirely. But there, upright, lit from beneath with the faint amber of a warm reactor, and standing at the cargo ramp with a sidearm in each hand, and an expression of profound relief mixed with professional wariness, was a woman Mara recognized. Lieutenant Commander Yanni Oduya, Kadaf, whom Mara had last seen 3 weeks ago, coordinating the first night evacuation from the station's command deck. "Sergeant Voss," said Oduya. "You look terrible." "Lieutenant Commander," said Mara. "You look like a person who's been waiting in a landing bay for 19 days. 18. I gave you up on day 1. She was already waving the group up the ramp. "How many?" 15 total. 13 military, 2 civilian settlers, and 1 CRA. Oduya's gaze moved to Harwick with the particular scan of someone assessing an asset of uncertain value. "Harwick," said Harwick, preemptively. "Deputy Director, Resource Administration, care of Station." "Good for you," said Oduya. "Get on the ship." The ramp was going up before they were all the way aboard. Mara found a space against the bulkhead and sat down and felt, for the first time in 19 days, the specific decompression of a body that has been operating at combat pitch for 3 weeks straight and has been given a temporary dispensation to be something other than a weapon. Her hands were shaking slightly. She looked at them with academic interest. Reyes sat down next to her. He was looking at his hands too. "You were right about the device," he said. "I know." He staged it to signal the Varric. Timed burst, set to go off on the plaza crossing. "I know." Why? What was he getting? Mara had been thinking about this. Priority extraction. CRA has separate protocols with the resource companies. If the Varric take the station, take it intact, on a timeline they control, certain administrative files transfer to Varric custody. The resource administration gets evacuated in exchange for not wiping those files. She kept her voice even. He wasn't selling us. He was just not accounting for us. We were acceptable loss in a transaction he'd already decided to make. Reyes considered this. That's almost worse. "Yes," said Mara. "What are you going to do?" She looked across the hold at Harwick, who had found a seat near the forward bulkhead and was sitting with his hands folded and his eyes down, the posture of a man who has completed a calculation and found it came out differently than expected, and is working on the next one. "I'm going to make a report," she said. "A very thorough report with timestamps. And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," said Mara, "I'm going to sit here for exactly 10 minutes and not think about anything." She lasted 6. The ship shook as it cleared the atmosphere. A long, shuddering groan of hull stress and thruster burn that felt, in the context of the last 19 days, like an embrace, and Mara was on her feet before she registered she was standing, moving to the forward viewport, where Oduya was in the co-pilot seat, running calculations with the focused calm of a pilot who has made harder departures. Below them, receding, the surface of Karev's second moon was a patchwork of the familiar and the transformed, the settlement she'd spent 11 months helping to build. and 3 weeks trying not to die in, was a collection of dark structures, and the geometric regularity of Varric occupation patterns. Their architecture imposed on human spaces, like a syntax that didn't fit the underlying language. She could see the transit plaza from here, tiny at this altitude, and the cargo hub, and the faint lines of the maintenance track. She could see, at the edge of the settlement, a cluster of reanimates beginning to move again. Dawn had come. The signal had fired. The dead walked their 6-hour shift and then rested, and then walked again, patient as tide, implacable as schedule. How many? Said Mara. Oduya understood the question. Karev overall? Hard to say. The Varric were careful about body counts. CRA data suggest approximately 40% fatality in the initial days, and those 40% are walking. Yes. Mara looked at the surface a moment longer. There are 12 occupied stations in this system, she said. Were, said Oduya. Were. The moon fell away beneath them. The gas giant Gregor filled the forward viewport for a moment. Its bruised purple bands, enormous and impassive. And then the ship rotated, and there was only the dark and the stars and the distant glitter of the Varric fleet in its occupation orbit. There were a lot of them. Mara had looked at those numbers, had worked through the tactical analysis with the section heads on day 1, had stood in the command deck, and watched the projections populate on the board with the patient avalanche of bad news that had sent 3 generals to their own ends. She knew the force ratios. She knew what the analysts said about them. She also knew something else. She knew that the Varric had been fighting a certain kind of war for longer than human civilization had existed, and that there was a specific problem with fighting a certain kind of war for a very long time. You optimized for it. You refined and streamlined and made it more efficient. You developed tools and protocols and systems that were exquisitely tuned to the exact threat you'd always faced, and in doing so, you systematically lost the capacity to respond to things that didn't fit those systems. The Varric's quiet reclamation was a perfect weapon against anything that behaved like a conquered species, that retreated into safe houses, that tried to wait out the dead in sealed shelters, that moved only when forced and conserved when possible, and behaved according to the logic of survival. It was a terrible weapon against something that learned. Mara had spent 19 days being educated by the Varric. She had learned the dusk signal, and the pre-dawn signal, and the 6-hour window, and the patrol rotations, and the emitter tower placement, and the gap in the thermal detection during the reanimate window. She had learned all of it. The way you learned things, when not learning would kill you, with absolute attention and zero margin for error. She turned away from the viewport. Torres was watching her. Osi was watching her. Pavel Oren was watching her. His arm around Dara's shoulders. His expression that same patient cataloging look he'd been wearing since the first day. Get me a map of the system, she said to Oduya. All 12 stations. We're 12, Oduya said. Are 12, said Mara. The Varric didn't destroy them. That's not what they do. They occupied them. The stations are intact. Oduya looked at her over her shoulder. Something moved in her expression. Not hope, not exactly. Too disciplined for that, but something adjacent to it. Something that had the shape of a question about to be answered. What are you thinking, Sergeant? Mara pulled up a schematic on the nav console. The system map, 12 points of light in their orbital positions, and the dense cluster of Varric fleet positions, holding occupation orbit around, each one. I'm thinking, she said, that the Varric have been doing this for a very long time, and that there is a difference between being old and being wise, and that we just spent 19 days learning everything they know about themselves. She touched 2 of the 12 points. These 2 stations are within mutual firing range of the Varric's primary emitter relay. If the relay goes, the dusk signal goes. If, Races said from behind her, the reanimates don't activate. Right, but there are still reanimates from the previous signal cycles, said Torres. They're still out there, just not getting activated. Yes, said Mara. So the Varric lose their weapon, but the threat remains. Except, she turned from the map. except the Varric have been managing the reanimate population for the duration of the occupation, keeping them corralled, directing them, preventing them from wandering into Varric infrastructure zones. They have containment protocols built into every emitter tower. The emitter towers are also the containment system. The room was quiet. If the relay goes down mid-signal, said Osi, slowly, while the reanimates are active, the containment protocols fail, said Mara. And the reanimates go everywhere, said Pavel Oren. Everyone looked at him. He said it without drama, with the tone of a man stating a mechanical fact about a pump or a drill bit. Yes, said Mara. Including into Varric infrastructure zones, said Reyes. Including into Varric occupation positions. Including into Varric fleet support structures, said Torres. And her voice had taken on a quality Mara hadn't heard in 19 days, something that cut through the exhaustion and the grief and the particular numbness of 3 weeks of survival. A quality she recognized because she felt it herself, precise and cold and very human. They built the weapon, said Mara. They put it in every station in this system. They calibrated it. They tested it. They refined it over centuries of campaigns. And they built the containment system to go with it, because you don't point a weapon like this without a way to manage the backscatter. She looked at the map. They handed us the blueprint. The silence held for another second. Then Oduya said, from the pilot seat, without turning around, "The relay is a hard target, Sergeant. We're talking about a military installation. Varric construction. Defended, yes. We have a medium hauler with 1 operational weapon mount, 15 exhausted people, and approximately 14 hours before the next dusk signal." "Yes," said Mara. "So we'd better be quick." She was looking at Pavel Oren, who was looking back at her with the expression she'd been watching for 3 days. The cataloging look, the look of a man who had been waiting to contribute something, and had finally found the shape of it. "Tell me about the relay," she said to him. He blinked. "I'm a mining engineer." "I know. The relay is powered by the same buried reactor network that powers the station's infrastructure. You spent 15 years running those systems." A pause. 17 years. Better, said Mara. Pavel reached out and pulled the schematic toward him. He looked at it for 30 seconds, in the particular concentrated silence of a man who is running stress calculations in his head without needing paper for it. "The relay has a tertiary power shunt," he said. "Same architecture as the main reactor bus. It's a Varric addition to the existing infrastructure. They built on top of what was already here because it was faster than building new. That means the relay's power feed runs through the same junction housing as the main grid. And if the junction housing takes damage at the right point during an active transmission," said Pavel, "the feedback through the relay would be considerable." "How considerable?" He thought about it. "It would light up this side of the system, and the signal. Mid-transmission catastrophic relay failure." He looked up from the schematic. "The signal would invert." Mara waited. "Instead of activating the reanimates," said Pavel, "it would try to deactivate the ones that were already active, which the system is not designed to do, which means it would push the deactivation signal at full power through whatever biological tissue it could reach." He set the schematic down. "It would kill them. Every reanimate in range of the relay's broadcast footprint. The signal would try to shut them down, and it would burn them out doing it." Dara Oren was watching her husband. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "Since day 4, he said. He said it simply without apology, with the tone of a man who had been doing the work he was capable of doing, and waiting for someone to ask. Mara looked at Reyes. Reyes looked at Mara. "Junction housing is on the station's surface," she said. "Southern quadrant, based on the power feed architecture." She pointed to the map. "We need to hit it at the exact moment of the next dusk signal. 14 hours. "You're not going back down," said Oduya. "I'm not going back down. I'm going to the relay junction, housing on the transmission platform of Station 9, which is unmanned, which the Varric haven't occupied in force, because it's a relay post, not a resource position. We hit the junction housing from orbit with the weapon mount. And we do it at precisely the moment the dusk signal begins to transmit. That's an extremely narrow window, said Oduya. Yes, if we're early, nothing happens. If we're late, the reanimates are already active and the containment is still working. Mara nodded. We have to be exactly on time. And if we are on time, said Torres, the signal inverts, the reanimates die, the containment fails simultaneously, and the Varric occupation positions get swarmed by. Nothing, said Mara. Because the reanimates are dead, but the containment failure trips every position's alert system. Every Varric position in this system goes to maximum alert response. They pull back, they concentrate, they do what every well-designed military force does when its containment assist fails across 12 stations simultaneously. They stop being spread thin, said Osi. They stop being spread thin. They concentrate. They go to emergency protocol. And, while they're doing that, Mara moved her finger across the map to the 2 stations she'd indicated before. The occupation forces on 12 stations are in chaos, in alert response, managing a mass deactivation event that their system says cannot be happening, fighting their own emergency protocols. And the civilian evacuation ships in the outer system get their window, said Oduya. Quiet. The evacuation ships, said OC. How many? 14 that I know of, said Oduya. Possibly more. They've been holding at the outer marker, waiting for the fleet to create a gap. She was quiet for a moment. One coordinated move. 14 ships get out. More than that, said Mara. Station populations. The reanimates would be dead, dead. For the first time in 19 days, the dead would stay down. She let that sit for a moment. Every survivor still in a sealed shelter on any of those 12 stations would have a window. The Varric in chaos. No reanimate threat. 14 evacuation ships incoming. The transport held its heading through the dark. Harwick, from his position near the forward bulkhead, said, "This is insane." "Yes," said Mara. "You're talking about attacking a Varric military installation with a cargo hauler, with a specifically targeted shot at a specific infrastructure component during a specific 14-second window." "Yes, they'll destroy this ship, probably," she said. "After the shot, we scatter. Oduya can plot evasion vectors." "I can," said Oduya, in the tone of someone who is already doing it. "If they destroy this ship," said Harwick, "we die." "Yes," said Mara. "You're willing to die for the 14 evacuation ships to get out, for the survivors on 12 stations to have a window." "Yes." She looked at him without hostility, without contempt, just with the clear eyes of a person who has resolved this particular question and no longer needs to revisit it. "You're not required to be, but you're on this ship, and this ship is going to Station 9. Those are the facts as they currently stand." Harwick opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his hands, said nothing. Torres was already pulling up the weapon mount diagnostics. Ozzy moved to the navigation station. Pavel had the schematic again and was writing on the back of a ration wrapper with a stylus stub, precise tiny notations. Dara Oren was watching Mara with an expression that was not gratitude and not admiration, but something quieter and more lasting than either. The expression of someone recognizing a shape they had not expected to see. 14 hours, said Reyes. 14 hours, said Mara. She sat back down against the bulkhead. She let herself close her eyes for a count of 10. Then she started to work. The 14 hours had the quality of a long pre-dawn watch, that particular compression of time where work fills the space so completely that duration becomes irrelevant. Torres rebuilt the weapon mount targeting system, using a repair kit and a service manual that existed only as a 50-page cached file on the ship's maintenance tablet, working through a fault in the alignment sensor that she corrected by bypassing the sensor entirely and mounting a manual sight using a piece of conduit and a calibration scope from the cargo hold toolkit. OC plotted 3 approach vectors and 2 evasion vectors, and a tertiary evasion in case the first 2 were closed, and ran the calculations twice on the nav computer and once on paper, checking the paper against the computer with the paranoid precision of someone who had stopped trusting single points of failure. Pavel Oren sat at the nav table for 6 hours. doing work that was not entirely explicable to anyone without 17 years of reactor engineering, producing in the end a single page of numbers that represented the exact timing sequence required, the moment of signal initiation, the propagation delay across the relay hardware, the 300ths of a second window in which a strike to the junction housing would invert rather than simply sever the transmission. Reyes cleaned weapons. He cleaned every weapon in the ship's small locker. And then he cleaned the weapons they'd come aboard with. And when he was done with that, he asked Pavel if there was anything he could reconfigure or brace or modify in the ship's structure to absorb weapons. Fire? And Pavel said yes, as a matter of fact. And they spent 2 hours working on the aft section, together with a methodology that looked improvised from the outside, and was in fact improvised, but was improvised by a combat engineer and a structural engineer, and was therefore improvised with great technical rigor. Mara wrote her report. She wrote it in full, with timestamps and direct quotes from memory, and the record of 2 intercepted transmissions that she annotated with context, and she wrote Harwick's name in it 43 times. She encrypted it with 3 separate keys and stored it in the ship's emergency beacon memory, which would transmit automatically if the ship was disabled beyond recovery. She wrote it not because she was certain it would matter, not because she was certain anyone would read it or act on it, but because the recording of things was its own act of resistance against the world's tendency to bury what it found inconvenient. She finished the report. She sat in the quiet of the cargo hold for a while. Pavel came and sat near her, not adjacent, at a respectful remove, and drank from a water pouch, and after a while said, "I worked those numbers in my head for 12 days before I told Dara." Mara looked at him. "She knew," he said. "She always knows, but I didn't say it out loud because I thought—" He paused. "I thought if I said it out loud to someone who could actually do something about it, I'd have to reckon with the possibility that it wouldn't work, that you'd listen and say it was impossible, and I'd have to stop believing it. Would that have stopped you from trying?" He thought about it seriously. "No," he said, "but it would have been harder." She thought about Chen, about the way Chen had hummed, quietly, under her breath, during any activity that didn't require her full vocal attention. Maintenance cycles, perimeter checks, the long watches. A tuneless little something half-formed. The musical equivalent of talking to yourself. Mara had never asked where it came from. It had just been there, the small persistent warmth of it, and then it hadn't been. "My first sergeant," she said, and stopped. Pavel waited. He used to say that the most dangerous thing in any engagement wasn't at the enemy's weapons or their numbers or their position. It was the moment when you stopped believing. The thing you were trying to protect was worth protecting, he said. Once you stopped believing that, you became efficient, optimized. You made the rational choice every time, and you never made the right one. What happened to him? He made it home, said Mara. Eventually. Most of us do, eventually. The ones who don't. She stopped again. The ones who don't, said Pavel, are why the ones who do keep going. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Dara, across the hold, who was asleep, in the way only people who have made their peace with uncertainty can sleep fully, without the flinching half-consciousness of someone still watching the door. 17 years married, said Pavel. We built the first drill housing on Karev together. She was the site manager, and I her reactor tech, and we disagreed about the power feed configuration for 8 months before she let me run it my way, and it worked, and she made me buy dinner. Mara almost smiled. She's going to be very angry with me for suggesting this, said Pavel. Did you suggest it to her? I didn't have to. He was quiet for a moment. She has always known what I was going to say before I say it. Mara thought about the expression on Dara's face when Pavel had spoken up about the relay inversion, the specific quality of it. Not surprise, not the brief flash of shock that everyone else in the room had shown, but something more like satisfaction of a person watching a long-running prediction come true. Station 9 in 40 minutes. Oduya called from the cockpit. Mara stood. The last 40 minutes had the density of the last 40 minutes of anything you have prepared for with everything you have, and which may or may not go the way you planned. She stood at Torres's shoulder, while Torres walked through the targeting sequence one more time, quiet and careful. Each step deliberate, no shortcuts, no assumptions. The manual sight was crude, but it was aligned. Torres had checked it 5 times with the calibration scope, and each time it had agreed with itself. And Torres was the kind of person whose hands did not shake under pressure, or if they did, she did not allow them to shake where the work was happening. OC brought them in on the second approach vector, which brought the junction housing into firing range at an angle that minimized exposure to the Varric patrol positions on the station's surface. The third approach would have been cleaner, but passed within 4 kilometers of a fleet support vessel. And OC had looked at the numbers and crossed it out. Station 9 came up on the viewport, a smaller installation than Karev, a relay and communications hub, lit with the even operational lighting of a place that was being used rather than occupied. The junction housing was on the transmission platform on the southern quadrant, exactly as Pavel had mapped it from the architectural records. From this distance, it was a cluster of 3 interconnected structures. The central one, marked by the distinctive ribbed exterior of a power feed. Housing, time to signal, said Mara. 11 minutes 40 seconds, said OC. Weapon mount charged, said Torres. Evasion vector 1 is clear, said OC. Maintain position, said Mara. Hold until signal initiation. The 11 minutes had the duration of geological events. She stood at the viewport and watched Station 9 and said nothing, and thought about Chen humming, and about Pavel's 17 years of numbers, and his wife who always knew what he was going to say, and about Reyes's hands, and the way he'd cleaned every weapon on the ship, with the patient thoroughness of a man who believed in the value of doing a thing completely, and about Torres at 19, getting her kit sorted in 40 seconds flat, and about OC's handwriting on the back of her hand, and the precise codes she carried in her body, because she didn't trust locks that required machinery. She thought about the 14 evacuation ships at the outer marker. She thought about the survivors in sealed shelters across 12 stations who had been holding the same night watch she'd been holding in their own cargo hubs and maintenance tunnels and service crawl spaces. She thought about what it would mean for the dead to stay dead. Signal initiation in 30 seconds, said OC. Tor, said Mara. Ready, said Torres. 20 seconds. Mara watched the junction housing on the transmission platform. At this distance, she could see the power feed structures begin to cycle, the distinctive light sequence of a Varric emitter preparing to transmit. A rolling activation that moved from the outer relay towers inward toward the central junction, a wave of light gathering toward a broadcast. 10 seconds. It's starting, said OC. The light sequence reached the junction housing. Fire, said Mara. Torres fired. The weapon mount was a single-shot directed energy unit, the kind rated for debris clearing and anti-intrusion, not for military engagement. At this range, against Varric-hardened infrastructure, it should have been barely adequate. It hit the junction housing at the precise moment Pavel's numbers had mapped. The feedback was not subtle. The junction housing detonated in a way that was architectural rather than explosive. A structured unwinding of contained energy, moving outward along the power feed lines in both directions simultaneously, reaching the relay transmitters at their peak charge and reversing through them, the signal already in flight across the system, meeting its inversion and tearing. The light went everywhere. Mara heard OC saying something that was probably a heading, and felt the ship lurch into evasion, and held onto the console and watched through the viewport as the sky above. Station 9 became briefly and completely wrong. The transmission platform lit from inside, towers cascading. The signal that had activated the dead across 12 stations for 19 days turning back on, itself with the violent absolute finality of a system trying to do something it was never designed to do. And across the system, across the 12 occupied moons and stations and outposts, where the dead had been walking every dusk and resting every dawn and walking again. The signal reached what it had made and unmade it. Tracking multiple Varric fleet movements, said Osei, tight and focused. They're pulling back from station orbits. Emergency concentrations. 3-4. A pause. All 12. Evacuation corridor, said Mara. Another pause. Open, said Osei. Torres let out a breath that Mara suspected had been held for longer than the last 30 seconds. From the cargo hold, Reyes said, 14 ships on the outer marker are moving. Mara let go of the console, straightened, put her hands at her sides. The ship was still in evasion. Osei was threading them through the chaos of the Varric fleet reorientation, using the concentration of their attention on the emergency protocols to put distance between themselves and anything that might turn its weapons on. A single fleeing cargo hauler. It was working. The Varric had larger things to manage. The dead were dead. She went back to the cargo hold and sat down against the bulkhead and let the shaking happen, because it was going to happen, whether she permitted it or not. And she had learned over a long career that there was a specific violence done to yourself by refusing to feel the things that needed to be felt when they needed to be felt. The shaking was fine. The shaking was just the body's invoice for the last 19 days. Dara Oren sat down next to her, not on the crate, at a respectful remove. Next to her, shoulder contact, the casual physical confidence of a woman who understood that the thing Mara needed right now was uncomplicated human adjacency. They sat like that for a while. My husband, said Dara presently, is going to spend the next 6 months explaining to every engineer who will listen why the relay inversion worked. He should, said Mara. He will also be insufferable about it. He's earned it. He absolutely has. Dara paused. He was right about the dinner, by the way. The power feed configuration. I made him buy dinner, and I spent the whole meal pretending. It was more reluctant than it was. Mara looked at her. Dara was looking straight ahead with the expression of someone who has been carrying a small warm secret for 17 years and has just decided to put it down. He knew, said Mara. Of course he knew, said Dara. That's why it was dinner. Mara almost laughed. The almost was enough. It was enough for now. Oduya's voice came from the cockpit. 14 evacuation ships, clear of the corridor. They're calling on the emergency band. Station survivors are responding. We have confirmed shelter populations on Karev, Station 4, Station 7. A pause. Sergeant Voss, we have confirmed shelter populations on all 12. Mara put her head back against the bulkhead and looked at the ceiling of the cargo hold. Steel and weld marks and a water stain that had probably been there since before the ship was pressed into emergency service, and the small notation someone had scratched in the corner, barely legible. The name and date of someone who had used this ship before left their initial record. In the material of it, the human to mark the things you've passed through so that the world knows you were there. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Reyes, who was looking at her. Report to file, he said. Report to file, she said. The Varric are going to recalibrate, he said. Patch the relay system. Redesign the containment protocols. Yes, so this doesn't work twice. No, she agreed. It doesn't work twice. We'll have to find something else. We always find something else, said Torres, from across the hold. Mara looked at her. Torres shrugged. We always do. She was right. That was the thing the Varric had failed to account for. The variable that their centuries of refined occupation tactics had no term for. The capacity for a species that had been given exactly enough information about their enemy's systems to take that information and turn it with both hands into a weapon, not through innovation, not through technological advantage, not through superior numbers or better weapons or harder armor, but through the specific stubbornness of people who had run out of other options and therefore stopped being limited by what was possible and started being limited only by what they could imagine. It wasn't the big victories. It wasn't the turning of the tide or the breaking of the siege. It was Pavel sitting in a cargo hub for 12 days running numbers in his head because he refused to stop looking for the shape of the answer. It was Torres mounting a manual sight with conduit and calibration equipment. It was Osei's handwriting on the back of her hand. It was the way Pavel and Dara Oren moved through the dark like a single organism, built over 17 years. It was Chen, humming. It was the small, persistent warmth of things that refused to stop. Mara closed her eyes. The ship ran on through the dark of the system, and behind it, on 12 moons and stations, the sealed shelters were opening. The dead stayed down. The living walked out into whatever came next.